Welcome to the Human AI Alliance. I'm your host, Lee Bristow. We invite guests onto the show who can provide detailed, high-resolution answers to questions we have about the Human AI Alliance. In this episode, we tackle one of the biggest questions in AI. Why do leaders need to care about AI? And so today we welcome Mark Ruddock, a Global Tech and Fintech CEO with 3 exits and over 25 years of experience in scaling companies from 5 million to 500 million in revenue. So thank you for joining the Human AI Alliance show. Welcome, Mark. How are you doing?
Great, Lee. Listen, thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to our chat today.
So let's start with the beginning. Your career started out as a developer. You moved up through the ranks to CEO. As mentioned, you've got 3 exits to your name, but you are rolling back to being a developer, and it all ironically unfolded on the back of a 6-hour flight. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so look, I'm a geek by training and a geek at heart, right? And I wasn't a developer, as a role for very long because during university, I actually created my first startup. And so it was very much a developer CEO right from the very beginning. But I would say that, having watched from afar as the AI revolution was happening around me, I was feeling somewhat curious and a little bit jealous about the fun that everyone else was having. And so after, 30 years or so of various CEO level jobs, the question I asked myself was it time to break and go back and play, get hands-on? And over many years, I'd kind of wanted to get back to coding a little bit on the side, but there was always a barrier to entry, right? It was all of this learning and then the setup. It just felt too complicated. And so when someone said to me, Mark, this stuff is really, it's about just telling the AI what to do and it writes the code for you. I was so curious. So I got on a plane from Vienna to Toronto, and I thought, let's see if someone who hasn't coded at that point for 25 years could write an app before I landed. Now, that was a year ago, or just over a year ago. And a year ago, the technology was still fairly nascent. And so it was not an easy experience to work through this and to kind of get the mental muscle going again about how to think like a developer and how to create product. But certainly one element of it was curiosity. The other element of it was, as someone who builds companies for a living, I think to understand where the puck is going, you kind of have to play the game. And so standing on the sidelines and trying to figure out if AI was going to be a transformative force in software development or company development, I didn't feel I could do that by kind of watching from the sidelines. I felt I needed to get my hands on it in a very tactile manner. And that flight really began a journey over the last 12 months that has been some of the most rewarding times of my professional career, just out of the pure enjoyment. And last thing I would say is this. I've always kind of been a product-oriented CEO. So to be able to work kind of at the speed of thought now is thrilling, right? To be able to dream products and have them come to life for almost no cost and in almost no time is a very compelling thing to be doing.
So, yeah, if you were to kind of fast forward into 2026, 27, and, as you mentioned, you started this whole process last year. Excuse me. You started the process last year. And so if coding is not the new skill and prompting is not the new skill, is product requirement documentation going to be like the new skill? It's essentially, is that product manager going to be the new big guy that is going to be in the room? Because it used to be the senior developer and the product guy would normally report into the senior developer. Do you think that relationship is going to pivot?
That's a very good question. I do think so. When we build companies and when we build tech teams, it was like this iceberg, right? You'd have a small number of product people and then a large iceberg below of developers doing the hard work of bringing all of this stuff to life. I think that's changing now. I think that iceberg is going to whittle down quite a bit. And instead of it being all human, it will be a combination of human and agents. And the agents create such accelerative power that unfortunately you're going to need fewer developers. So the question becomes, where does the value lie in the product equation? Well, I think it lies up in the product ideation, people with taste, people with vision, and people who are kind of able to understand at a very deep level the problem domain that they're trying to solve. And so the modern moat actually becomes a unique understanding of a problem domain and an unbelievable velocity of execution against that problem domain, not what it used to be, which was, technical moat with millions of lines of software built that would be very expensive and very time consuming for anyone else to build. So to me, that elevates the importance of the product owner, the product visionary, and the product manager. And what's been very interesting over the last year is to watch how my relationship with the AIs has changed from thinking of them as tools to actually thinking of them more as teammates. So my own relationship with the AI agents has very much shifted towards what a product manager or CTO's relationship with their team would be, right? And not just here's a bunch of hammers and nails and I'm going to build something with. And so I think, to your point, those are very important skills now. And I think the value is going to accrue to the people who can build creative, imaginative, tasteful products and get 100x leverage from the use of agents. So yes, that value equation may shift from the very, very expensive developers that you had to hire millions of across the United States, let's say, to now a very small number of very influential, very powerful product leaders.
Sure. I love that the relationship as a CTO with your agents basically becoming almost that employee type kind of relationship, if you will. So like if I put my thinking hat on again and look towards the future, if you're a startup and you've managed to raise 10 million on the back of an idea, essentially, does that org chart look like 50 agents or 5 super agents? Because that's kind of what I'm hearing, is it's going to be one guy, one founder, one person with a lot of knowledge around a particular problem, and then the velocity. So is it going to be orchestrating 50 or 5 super agents? And what does that org chart look like, assuming again also elements around people oversight and things like regulation in terms of humans in the loop and all the rest of it? So there needs to be more, but what does that future org look like?
I don't think we're at the stage. I think we've seen some evidence that the single founder businesses have now been created and some have even exited. But I don't think that's where we are in the mainstream quite yet. And I'm not sure that's where we're going to be even for the near term. And let me explain. To build a successful startup is not just about building product. It's about understanding go-to-market. It's being able to sell. It's being able to position. It's being able to think critically about what the competitive arc looks like and so on. And it will therefore depend on the skills of the founding team as to whether they have a critical mass of those skills necessary to build a successful startup. So I do think you're going to have more than a singleton experience in building a company going forward. The question is, what is the production side of the house end up looking like? It will not look like 100% humans and 0% agents, but it will probably also not look, at least in the near term, like 100% agents and 0 humans. Yeah. And I think this actually raises a really interesting issue. I read an article recently about a team that had kind of gone from 100 people to 10 in the software development team. But they realized that those 10, the way they were operating with AI, 100x their capability. And so they were able to pay those 10 substantially more than they ever would have paid them before, because in effect, they didn't need the 100, right? And so I think you're going to see a world where there is a hybrid of human and agentic leverage. And I think those agents are not just going to be in technology, they're going to be in marketing. They're going to be in product research. They're even going to be in BDR and sales outreach. But they are, I think we are on a continuum that is still very much evolving. And we have work still to do. So the myth of the single founder company, I think, is very interesting and attractive, but we're not quite there yet. But I would tell you that the number of people it takes to found a company has radically reduced. And the amount of venture capital it will likely take to at least get to proof of product market fit has radically reduced. So the question becomes, do you need the 10 million that you just articulated? Or do you need a great degree less? And that may actually create challenges for venture capital in how they think about, the way in which they monetize and develop, a return on their LP's capital.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought process. I'm gonna go down a slightly different route because I want to kind of stay within the startup realm for a bit. So I had a conversation relatively recently about an organization called Crescendo out of the States. They were a 50-person business in AI creating workflows primarily for contact centers. And they recently closed out on an acquisition of a 3,000-person business, which I thought was really interesting. So here's a small AI startup that added a huge chunk of professional services to their organization, which I thought was really, really interesting, right? And the part that I found particularly interesting was they moved away from a SaaS type licensing model and they went to an outcome-based licensing model. And I thought that was really interesting because it just it showed another angle around creating a different moat. So if the moat before was in order to be able to create a very big software, you needed a lot of hardware, a lot of people, and the cost essentially became the moat. The inverse potentially is now there is that the actual cost of software is going to go through the floor, the number of people and all the rest of it. So that moat is no longer there. The complexity is no longer there. So now you need to add a different type of moat. And the moat, as you are highlighting, is the velocity piece. So if you can add a velocity piece to your licensing, that potentially is your moat. So I see that as a shift in the future licensing of SaaS going forward. Instead of this really expensive monolithic piece of software that gets installed and deployed, it's going to be smaller, agile pieces of software, but at the same time, focusing not on the cost of the licensing and giving you the tools to do the job. You're almost going to outsource the entire job in itself in terms of the AI, as in the software piece and the people. Do you think that is Crescendo just a kind of a pilot that is going to kind of flame and die? Or do you think that this is potentially the new paradigm shift in terms of the way that AI is going to influence software and SaaS deployments?
So there are two things about the Crescendo story that I think are interesting. And let's talk about the pricing model first. I think that I've always been a fan of value-based pricing, where the customer pays for the value they accrue from the software. Historically in SaaS, because these tools were kind of automation helpers for people, the more people you had using the tool, in effect, the more you correlated to value. That is no longer the case. And in fact, ruthlessly, you may be needing fewer and fewer people in your organization. And so how do you price on the basis of seats when the actual software itself potentially is going to be reducing the number of seats? And I think that's where you pivot to outcome-based pricing or value-based pricing that says, you would have had 5,000 people in your cost center before, now you need 50. But in moving from 5,000 to 50, you are increasing your margin tremendously. We're going to take a little piece of that margin as a software company because we're basically helping you deliver, significantly from that. So I think you're going to see that happen. And I think that's a given even in some of the bigger software companies now, not just in Crescendo.
Yeah.
But there's a second piece of this that's interesting. The the way in which AI is now poised to transform human-heavy industries is creating an opportunity for consolidation and rationalization of several industries today. So, industries that have always done something a certain way, and let's say there's 5,000 little companies in Canada or 20,000 in the United States doing this little thing, because there really was never an economy of scale for that company, and so on. I think there's a world in which, as the AIs replace what humans used to do, the legacy business model no longer works. And so for private equity, looking at those 20,000 companies, they would say, if we actually consolidate a bunch of these human-heavy, low-margin companies into high-margin, AI-driven companies, we can build a substantial business that no longer needs 20,000 instances, but could have 5, but still, in effect, delivering value to that customer base. So I think you're going to see changes in business models, changes in pricing models, and I think you're going to see a significant consolidation as well. And you're starting to see that already in accounting. There's some evidence that some of that might even start to happen in law and in other very heavy IP-oriented industries as the technology changes the fundamentals of the underlying business models. So I think Crescendo is your kind of canary in the coal mine for 2 reasons, not just pricing.
Yeah, I think that also talks to something that you and I have spoken about, the hyper verticalization. So you can actually, you take that accounting as an example, and you got these small little niche SaaS businesses, and you literally convert them as you highlighted. But it's not necessarily individually, their assets are not particularly big, but collectively, and the cash that they generate can provide a very strong return on investment for investors going forward. Which kind of talks to maybe the next piece that I wanted to bring up with you, which was when you're determining the value of a business going forward, right? So right now, the value of a business would typically be around its clients, its revenue, but also its people, because that in itself has key intrinsic value, and the knowledge of that, the institutional knowledge that they carry, sometimes 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that is built into that core team, into that core leadership. And again, that is looking at the organization and looking at the fundamentals of the organization and how that business is being led. So when you think about the future of that evaluation, when the company is made up of people and agentic workflows, and then potentially swarms with orchestrators sitting on top of that, how do you actually build that out as an asset class? How do you evaluate it? Is it based on its IP? Is it based on, again, where does that value sit? And maybe there is something you can unpack in there?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it depends on several factors: the nature of the business, the nature of the industry, the stage of the business, and so on. But let me just point to kind of a handful of things that I think might influence value going forward. So the first is that if a business, because they are first to identify a disruptive use of something like AI, is going to change the competitive landscape in their industry over a period of time and develop an unfair competitive advantage and effectively steal enterprise value from the legacy incumbents, that is one view that a private equity or investor would look at and go, wow, okay, this for every dollar I put into this, we're going to see 10x coming back out, because they're just going to destroy a large chunk of their competition. So I think let's call that a business model driven valuation. The second question is, to what extent do we move from a world where you are paying for the very, very smart humans in the business, where the IP is historically stored? And by the way, you can see this still happening today, as the very few people in the world who truly understand how to build AI models are being, traded at large numbers of multiples of 10, right? The question becomes, how do you value the intrinsic AI in the business, so the agentic workflows, and the IP that's now being trapped or developed within those AIs. So are companies building proprietary knowledge in their agentic layer that is effectively the proxy for what we used to do when we valued companies, which were the smart humans that had the AI, that had the IP in the first place. And so I do think, maybe they are echoes of the way in which we valued businesses before, but those will change to potentially agentic IP instead of just human IP. And then the third element of this will be one of velocity. Does this company move at the pace that effectively becomes thrilling for their clients? In other words, it becomes a tailwind for their clients' aspirations in a way that no other company can, because it's literally evolving in near real time to power those customers and what they want to do. And I'm no private equity person, but to me, you will see brand new ways of valuing companies. You will see the potential for disruption probably being one of the biggest value drivers, but you will see a shift away from human IP valuation towards agentic IP valuation, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. So if you were brought in, let me rephrase that, into a business as an advisor, and they said, Mark, listen, I've got 150 people downstairs that are coding away, they are deving away. I've got the board breathing down my neck because costs are going through the roof. We're not implementing AI. We've tried to. It's just not quite getting into our business. And again, that story is not new, especially in traditional businesses. And they really are getting a lot of stick from the board, and the board is just saying implement AI. That isn't a strategy. That is definitely not a strategy. But how would you practically advise that CEO to start enabling their team to be effective, as opposed to just throwing stuff at the wall and expecting a positive outcome?
Look, I think with all of these things, the question starts with what does your business want to be when it's forced to grow up, right? So you've got to kind of look ahead of where the puck is today and ask the question, what am I going to need to be to thrive in this world that is changing around me? You start with that question. And that may mean a fundamental shift in business models. It may mean a shift in business strategy. But I can promise you one thing, it is going to require a shift in business velocity. Because everything is changing around us, the companies that cannot evolve quickly, that don't have a vision of where they want to go, by the way, which is compelling, and then evolve very quickly towards that vision, are going to lose. So if you start with that question, then you have to bake back into the question of, so what do we do? Do you have the right people for that journey? Right? And if the team internally is saying, we're software craftsmen, we'll never use AI, everything has to be hand coded because it's the special sauce and the essence of who we are and where we're going, I would argue that someone is going to run right over you who is working at a very different velocity and a very different cost base, and is probably going to do things long before you could do them. So the kind of ponderous thinking mentality of the past is not going to work. Now, the problem is you've got to get there from here. So you don't just throw out 150 people, right? you have to think very carefully based on what strategy is going to help you win, how you begin to build the building blocks in your DNA, right, to become that company that you have to be. And sometimes that might start with a skunk works. But ultimately, I think I'm a big believer as a CEO in a pull-based model of transformation, right, where people aren't whipped into doing this stuff. They are led because they're excited by a transformational vision. And if you don't have the people inside that can be excited by this and can think differently and think in new ways, you need to replace them. Over time, though, I think what you're going to see is one of two things happen. for every 1,000 developers historically you might have needed to produce X amount of work, 5 years from now, you're probably going to need 10. I'm being deliberately provocative in saying that, but I think that's possibly true. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do I go down to 10 and do the same amount of work? Or do I maybe stop at 100 and do many multiples of the things I could have been capable of before? So I think the answer to your question is nuanced, right? It really depends on the context of the business. If the business is in an area where AI is going to potentially disrupt the very business model itself and give that company a chance to win against their peers, then you start with that and you work backwards as to who do we have to be in order to be that company when we grow up, as opposed to just blindly saying, I think we can cut 150 people down to 50, right? And that's just because as a CEO, I'm pathologically kind of focused on the future and kind of focused on the arc, the narrative arc of the business and where it's going and the North Star and so on. What I would say is this, though, in my own experience, and by the way, this is changing the way I think about humans. So unfortunately, my expectations as I work with AI are becoming unreasonable. I expect to be able to work with Claude Code, envisage a new product feature, and have it built within the next, 10 minutes. When I sit down with a human and I say, I want to think about this product feature, and they say, look, I'll come back to you in 2 weeks. Like, it gives me hives now, right? And so I think we're in a time where this kind of cultural transformation at the leadership level and within the DNA of a company is also going to be critical, because you can't take 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, a year to think things through deeply anymore. You need to really, in many respects, start to execute very quickly. And so that is the third element of this, which is a true cultural transformation within the company that you are advising that's going to put in place the kind of people that will lead that transformation effectively. But yeah, it's ruined me as a CEO. Like, I'm probably going to be brutal on the humans that work, with me going forward, because my expectations have now been set by these agents.
Yeah, that's going to be challenging, and I fully agree with you. I mean, in terms of my world of developing core governance artifacts, like that the time, the effort, the outcome is actually not necessarily time reduced, but more the outcome, because you still need the embedding of the items to happen on the other side. So that does take time, but having the actual tools, mechanisms, automation, playbooks, all of that needs to be developed to a higher level and more detailed level that can then enable for automation going forward. But the story that you're basically telling, and I was just kind of thinking about it, it's basically Jim Collins' Good to Great. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a story about Kimberly Clark and their CEO, Darwin Smith. I believe his name was. He basically sold out all of their mills. So their entire company was built around this idea of creating paper, and he literally sold everything, took all the money and pumped it into nappies and Kleenex, basically. And at the time, everyone said that he was absolutely stark raving mad, including the shareholders, and the share price tanked. But he had a vision. He knew what was at stake, and he executed against that. I'm assuming he would have had to have had the board completely behind him, not assuming that he would have. And he would have had to have a strong leadership team that bought into it, because every single person from the board all the way down to his most junior of senior managers needed to be able to take heat and go, no, we have a plan. We know what the plan is, and we're executing against that plan. And the plan will be done at these points, and these are the milestones. And I'm sure there would have been off ramps for everybody's sake, to basically potentially bullet the plan, and also potentially fire Darwin Smith. But they didn't, and they executed it well. And that strategic intention and board all the way down to senior management having a very clear view of what the future is going to hold and the amount of money that is going to take in order to be able to create that. Because remember, I mean, you would need to change the entire business, the entire stack of business, the knowledge within that business. And they went from, in Jim Collins' quote, I think it was mediocre business to an exceptional business.
Mm-hmm.
That's
I think
the kind
those
of thinking.
opportunities abound now, but you're quite right. That it doesn't matter how many agents you have, you're going to need brilliant leadership and capable leadership and visionary leadership and the right kind of culture that is curious and ambitious and willing to think outside the box in order to win going forward. So I don't, it doesn't matter how many agents you have, you're still going to need great humans, I think, at the end of the day, to set the course and to kind of collaborate together on this. To me, I'll leave you with one kind of, or two parting thoughts. One is, on the opportunity side, the ability to amplify vision and create and instantiate it into real products has never been better, right? But the better the vision, the more the 10x matters. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the implication of that on our company makeup, on the number of people we need to hire, and frankly, on the economic landscape over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be very tricky for us at the nation state level. And I think that if we don't have the kind of political class that is able to comprehend this impact and lay the groundwork for, what is going to be a very difficult transformation, I think it could be a very difficult 5 to 10 years economically for many of us. And I, that is something that is talked about, but I think deliberately glossed over at times. And I think we need to lean into thinking very carefully about that as well. So there's a very real human impact of all of the stuff that we've been talking about.
Thank you very much for your time, Mark. I really, really appreciate it. This has been a fantastic conversation. There was a few more areas I wanted to go into, but we have run out of time. So yeah, to our audience, thank you for joining. If you found this conversation interesting and valuable, please share it with someone that you feel would benefit from its message. And if you would like to reach out to me, please do so via LinkedIn. And in closing, Mark, how could the audience get in touch with you?
I think the best thing to do is reach out on LinkedIn and gladly have a conversation. I'm very curious, actually, about how people are thinking differently about this space and this time. And I'd love to kind of engage you.
Amazing. Mark, thank you again. And on that note, goodbye.